So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this issue of expanded background checks. It's something that after each of the mass public shootings that have occurred, President Obama has come forward and pushed it. Hillary Clinton, it's been one of the big talking points that she has. Who can't support expanded background checks? These are background checks on the private transfer of guns. The problem is that there are real costs to these types of rules, costs that aren't normally talked about at all. I just had a camp ride in yesterday where I was talking to the driver, and he was talking about how he's in favor of guns, but he supported reasonable rules like expanded background checks. And he had no idea a lot of the facts that he was going to tell you, and I think it made a difference when I was talking to him, and I think it generally makes a difference in these discussions, and it's important to bring up if we care about safety. So the first thing to know is that these background checks aren't costless. You think that they are. You go and you buy a gun at a licensed dealer. There's no additional fee that you pay for it. You think it doesn't cost anything. But when the president in January did the little town hall that he did on CNN, and there was a woman who had been raped brutally for 3.5 hours. I don't know if anybody saw that. She asked the president, said, why do you want to make it more costly, more difficult for law-abiding people to be able to go and get a gun for protection? And the president, who lives in Washington, D.C., said, no, none of the rules that I'm proposing would make it more costly or difficult for people to be able to have guns. And that's simply false. In D.C., for you to transfer a gun from one person to another, you have to go through the FFL there in the district, and you have to pay $125 to transfer the gun. In New York City, in order to transfer a gun, there's one licensed firearms dealer in New York City who will transfer it for $125. Another dealer, they'll transfer it for $150. Basically, everybody else is $175 on up to be able to transfer a gun. Now, you can look around at different states. Some of them are much cheaper. The cheapest state right now for transferring a gun through an FFL is Oregon, which is like $55 to do that. But whether it's $55 or $125 or something in between, those are real costs for people to be able to go and pay a gun. It might not stop you or I from being able to go and get a gun for protection. But the type of people that my research indicates are the most vulnerable people, the ones who benefit the most from having a gun for protection, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, poor blacks who live in high-crime, inner-city, urban areas. $125, even $60 may make the difference between whether or not they're able to legally afford a gun to be able to protect themselves and their families. That's a real cost. Another problem that we have with the current system is, let me just say one other thing, and that is, you don't see these costs normally. I mean, these costs are in the price of a gun. You buy a gun from a dealer, you're paying that fee. You just don't see it. It's kind of like if we change the sales tax law so that rather than adding the sales tax onto the price of something that was already incorporated in the price of the product, you wouldn't see it. The sales tax would still raise the price just as much. And the same thing is true with these background checks. It's a real cost. It makes a difference. I mean, one can only imagine how much more gun sales would have gone out if you didn't have this tax that you have all the time. And it raises a real issue, and that is, who should pay for this tax? Even if you believe that there should be background checks, there's still the question of who should pay for it. But I'm an economist. In economics, one of the things you learn is that when you have these government programs, the person who benefits from the service should be the one who pays for it. And in this case, if you believe, and I don't, but if you believe that these background checks lower the cost of people being able to go, or lower crime rates, then it should be everybody who pays for it. You should pay for it out of general revenue, rather than going and imposing just a tax on those people who are trying to buy a gun. Now, I've talked to gun control advocates for well over 15 years or so about this type of issue. And if you bring up the issue about saying, well, why not pay for this out of general revenue? It's like holding a cross up to a vampire. He goes to a when you bring it up. I think there's an easy reason to understand that, and that is the reason why they want this, I've come to believe, isn't because they want to lower crime rates. Per se, what they want to do is make it more costly for people to be able to go and get a gun to own. I'll give you a couple examples. In 2013, when Colorado was passing its expanded background check system, I'm sure most of you have heard about that, there were several state senators that were recalled as a result of that. I was talking to some members of the state legislature, and I had an idea to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax on transferring guns. There's essentially two costs in Colorado. One, you have to pay a state tax, and then you have to pay a fee that just goes to the licensed dealer who's going to conduct the transfer for you. With the exception of two pro-gun Democrats, every single Democrat in the state house voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax that was there. How many taxes can you think of where virtually all the Democrats in a legislature are going to vote against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay that tax? In Maryland, where now it costs something like about $300 to license and register a handgun when you include the fees for the training and the different fees that you have to pay the state on both yourself as well as the licensing fee as well as the registration fee for the gun. A similar attempt was made. I talked to some members of the state legislature. I made a suggestion that they put up an amendment there that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the state taxes and fees that were there. Because the Democrats controlled over 2/3 of the state house and the state senate, they wouldn't even let the amendment come up for a vote. I think that goes a long ways to explaining what the motivation is behind it. So now, we have riots in Baltimore last year where, it's costing $300 for poor people to be able to go and own a handgun for protection, and yet the mayor in the city there is telling police to stand down and not go and try to stop the riots there. So it raises some real questions. So that's the first issue about fees, making it costly, and if they really were serious, how they could solve it. The second problem is the current background check system is just a mess. One thing that relatively few people realize is that when the president, or Hillary Clinton, goes out and says that there have been 2.4 million prohibited or dangerous people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks, that's simply a lie. What they should say correctly is that there have been 2.4 million initial denials. But there's a huge difference between an initial denial and saying that somebody has been, a prohibited person has been stopped from buying a gun. I'll give you a simple analogy. You may remember the late Senator Ted Kennedy. There were 5 times where he was stopped from flying because somebody with a similar name to his was on the no-fly list. It was somebody connected with the Irish Republican Army that the British had put on the no-fly list. He was stopped from flying 5 times. He eventually got on a plane and flew. Would we count those 5 times as 5 times a terrorist was stopped from flying? Most people presumably not. Okay? And surely President Obama and Hillary Clinton wouldn't count that as 5 times that they stopped a terrorist from flying, I assume. But yet, that's the way they count it when they're talking about background checks stopping prohibited people. It's one thing to stop somebody who's a felon from buying a gun. It's another to stop somebody who has a similar name to a felon from buying a gun. And I'll take questions. And so, the problem is we don't know the exact rate of false positives because the government doesn't release all the information that's required there. What I can tell you is that there are 5 stages of review. The last year that the federal government put out what it's called this kind of annual, and I would call kind of almost annual report on the NICS system was 2010. The Obama administration, I think for some obvious reasons, has stopped releasing that. But If you look at the last year, there are 5 stages of review. The first stage of review is they just go at the National Office for the BATF and just check the paperwork. Is it the person that we think that it is? And at that stage, you basically had about 94% of the cases drop. No discretion, just trying to make sure whether they really have the right person or not. The next stage is that they send them out to the field offices for the BATF to review the cases. Again, no discretion. Again, just checking the paperwork to make sure that they have the right person that's there. At that stage, about a little bit over another 2% are dropped. So in the first 2 stages of review, about 96% of the cases are dropped. I don't know what happens exactly in the other 3 stages of review, but my guess is the total false positive rate is something over 99%. And that raises some real problems, okay? One of the problems is that when you're talking about 2.4 million people, some of those people may really need a gun quickly for self-defense. And when you go and you stop them from being able to go and buy it and put them in limbo for months, that may make the difference between whether or not the individual is going to be able to successfully defend themselves or not. There's another broad problem with this, and that is the current background check system, there's just no 2 ways about it, is racist. The way to think about it is people tend to have similar names to others in their racial groups. So, for example, 40% of Vietnamese in the United States have the same last name. Hispanics tend to have names similar to other Hispanics. To some extent, blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. And the problem is, take something like blacks, for example. You have about 30%, over 30% of black males in the United States, unfortunately, are prohibited from legally buying a gun because of criminal background issues. Who are they most likely to create a false positive? Another law-abiding black male. The same with Hispanics. If I have a Hispanic that is not allowed to legally buy a gun, who is he most likely to have a similar name to? A law-abiding Hispanic man. And so the problem that you have is that the people who I would argue generally need guns, the most law-abiding citizens in those minority communities who try to go and buy a gun, they're the ones who are being falsely stopped because of the errors that are made in these background checks. There's no reason why you should have these errors. Private companies go and do criminal background checks all the time. If they had a false positive rate, even a tiny fraction, even a 50th, the rate that the federal government has false positive, they'd be sued out of existence. There are rigid federal rules that allow people who have false positives in criminal background checks to sue private companies. But the same standards that the government requires that private companies have to meet, the federal government itself is not required to have to meet when it goes and does background checks. The problem is even worse. Under the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, when the government made a mistake, eventually they would go and check and say, look, we made a mistake, we should have let you go and buy a gun, you can go and legally buy a gun. As of about 8 months ago, the Obama administration had pulled off the rest of the people who went and double-checked these things to see whether errors have been made. They now have no one who's going through and double-checking these forms automatically. Now you can do it. You can go, apply, fill out the forms. Anybody can do that. In theory, though, it probably makes a lot of sense to hire a lawyer. You're talking about a couple $1,000 to go through the process. Again, just like with the fees that we talked about earlier, who are you most likely to stop from being able to legally buy a gun because of those costs? Again, it's going to be poor people who live in high-crime urban areas who are going to be priced out of being able to own a gun. So not only do we charge them the fees to begin with, but because of the racist way that the background check system is set up, these are the very people who are going to be stopped from being able to go and legally buy a gun to try to go prove, in fact, these erroneous false positives have been made for these individuals that are there. So for both of these points, they're easily solvable, okay? With the fee, you can pay for it out of general revenue. There's no reason why you should go and tax an individual to do it. In fact, gun owners should be the last person you should tax, because the fact that some people own guns out there make it risky for criminals to go and break into people's homes. And that produces a benefit. So those shouldn't be the people you tax. Now, and with the false positives, you can fix that by basically, right now, the way the federal government does it is they look at phonetically similar names and whether or not you have the same birthday. Have a particular birthday. Private companies don't just look at that. Private companies look at social security number, as well as name, birthday, address. They throw in basically all sorts of information. That information is collected on the 4473s when you go and you fill it out. There's no reason why they can't use that information. The same information that a private company does when it goes and does a background check and eliminate these types of false positives. There's a third issue that comes up, and that is the possibility that these expanded background checks can be used to go and create a national registration. And right now, the federal government is forbidden by law from going and retaining the records that they do on the background checks. Within 24 hours after the federal government has successfully completed a background check, they have to eliminate the information that they have. Now, there have been some problems with the Obama administration following that, but put that aside, all right? The problem that you face is that the 4473s that you fill out and go to the licensed gun dealer, he's mandated to have to keep those 4473s. And he has to keep it basically as long as he's in business in some period of time after that. And so the problem that you have is that, let's say, right now, we were to go and have a national expanded background check system where not only all new guns, but all transfers of guns would be recorded and the records kept for, let's say, 5 years, 8 years from now. Let's say President Hillary Clinton decides, you know, we have all these expanded background check forms that we filled out. I want you to photocopy them and send them in to the federal government, and then they can digitize them, or a lot of them are already digitized at the dealer. And then they have instant national background check that's set up there. And, well, you know, the claim is that there's a big benefit from having this registration. And that's simply false. You know, in theory, if you register a gun and the gun is left at the crime scene and it's registered to the person who committed the crime, then in theory, you could go and trace the gun back to the person who committed the crime and arrest him. There's a few problems with that. One is, crime guns are virtually never left at the scene. To the extent that they are left at the scene is because the criminal's either been killed or seriously wounded. And the few times that they're left at the scene, they're not registered, or in the couple times where they are registered, they're not registered to the person who committed the crime. Hawaii has had registration and licensing of guns since 1960. DC's had it for decades. Chicago's had it. I testified some years ago in Hawaii when they were thinking of changing the registration system, and I was working with some state legislators there. And I gave them 2 questions to ask the Honolulu police chief before he came in. One, to go back through his records and find out the number of crimes that they've been able to solve as a result of the registration licensing program in Hawaii. The second question I asked was, how much it costs each year to run the registration licensing program? Well, when the police chief came in and testified, he said they could not identify one single crime that had ever been solved as a result of the licensing and registration program. And he estimated that it took 50,000 hours of police time each year to go and run the program. That's 50,000 hours of police time where police could go and do the types of things that we know work on the street there. Okay, police are extremely important. Anybody who's read any of my books know that I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But, you know, removing 50,000 hours of police time each year has a real impact. A few years ago, the D.C. police chief was deposed, and she was asked whether the department was able to identify any crimes that had been solved as a result of licensing and registration. And the D.C. Police Department could not identify any crimes there either. Canada, which has had registration of licensing handguns since 1934, and for about 15 years had registration and licensing of long guns, could not identify any crimes that had been solved that otherwise wouldn't have been solved without the registration and licensing. So you have this argument, as I just said, registration and licensing doesn't produce a benefit. So how can you protect from having this national registration program? And there's a concern that people have. We've just seen California use registration to confiscate guns. New York's recently used registration to confiscate guns. Connecticut's recently used registration to confiscate guns. People have a real concern that what might be legal now might, in some near-term time in the future, they can use the registration to go and get guns. So how do you allay people's fear? Well, essentially, you go and have the same type of rule that you have federally for the federal government applied to FFL. Maybe you can make it 6 months, maybe you can make it a year, something like that. But you have to keep it relatively short, or at some point in the future, you're going to create a temptation where they're going to have a national registration list of law-abiding individuals. Okay? To the extent that that's a benefit from them knowing who legally, because it's only going to be the most law-abiding individuals who are going to be willing to go through a background check on a private transfer of a gun, let's say. So anyway, that's basically the discussion about background checks, because this is going to be a big issue in the campaign. California has background checks that they're going to be imposing on ammunition, possibly, an initiative that's coming up this year. Arizona and Nevada have initiatives on these expanded background checks at the state level. And of course, Hillary Clinton's going to be pushing for this at the national level. And so it's important for you all to be able to explain to people, not just right to buy them, but why these things endanger safety. Why the very people who need guns the most are the ones that the way they want to implement the system are going to be the most vulnerable and going to be the ones who are going to be prevented from being able to go and protect themselves.